Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Luke Brown. I'm a clinical psychologist, part of the week at least, in the Black Country. And I also work on the clinical doctorate at the University of Birmingham, teaching the new generation of clinical psychologists about how to become psychologists, but also on an equality, diversity and inclusion project, which is funded by HEE. The project has multiple strands about the curriculum changes, selection processes, mentoring schemes. But one of the work streams is around working with local leaders and collaborating with other organisations to promote greater diversity in the workforce. So why is ethnicity and mental health important? Well, I don't need to go through all the literature, I'm sure you're aware, but historically the relationship between minoritized communities and psychological therapies haven't been the best. We know there are really poor outcomes in terms of mental health, in terms of talking therapies, poor access to psychological therapies and psychological services, coercion and adversity in the pathways to care. And these results are kind of quite nicely summarised in a document by the Race Health Observatory, who kind of identify all the health inequalities across the board, including physical health and mental health. We'll have some really clear kind of summaries that are important for us to kind of recognise as we lead and run services. So why does ethnicity and mental health matter in a clinical sense anyway? Well, we're aware now in the latest census of the change in national demographics around ethnicity. Britain is becoming more diverse, and we see that both at the England and Wales levels and also in England as well. And so communities are growing from different backgrounds, and so that's really important for us to think about across the spectrum really in terms of physical health and also mental health. We're also aware of the links between mental health and social factors, and these are kind of referred to in the literature as often as social determinants of health or mental health. And I don't know if many people have read much of the work by Sir Michael Mormont or his reviews on the links between inequality in the system and health outcomes. They're definitely well worth a read, but really advocate this idea that we need to be thinking about health inequality, social inequalities, and how those things map onto the mental health and well-being of the population. Minoritized groups often lived in very deprived areas, and so there is likely, or often in certain areas at least, an overlap between inequality, ethnicity, and poorer health care outcomes. So in my area of psychosis, we know that particularly to be true. Adverse childhood experiences, deprivation, poverty, poor housing, all these things seem to have a real impact on people's mental health and can lead to higher rates of certain conditions. And so these kind of conversations around the link between ethnicity and the social and material world begins to raise lots of moral and ethical questions for us as clinicians really about the healthcare system. You know, who does the healthcare system work for? Who benefits? Who's thriving through it? And who is struggling and not getting access? And I guess these points all kind of culminate into a kind of a political kind of question really. And what does it really mean for us to live in a more diverse Britain, in more diverse communities? And what does that mean for us in terms of the delivery of healthcare and the equality that we experience within the healthcare system? And so the documents that have been mentioned today by Adrian and by Helen around the future of psychological professions and mental health all have a commitment to thinking about diversity in one form or the other in terms of how we respond to communities from diverse backgrounds, but also in terms of the workforce. So what's our responses clinically? Well, we could just ignore that this thing exists and just continue as usual really. And with very busy, demanding jobs, that's sometimes quite an easy thing to do, bury your head in the sand and think that actually ethnicity is unimportant. But one of the responses might be about doing more research and audit and service evaluation in our particular areas, thinking about the communities that we work with, the populations that are on our doorsteps and how they're accessing the services and how are their outcomes. And that can be done at psychologists at all levels, really, from assistant levels right up to consultant levels, thinking about the diversity needs of the populations we work with. There may be kind of specific equality, diversity and inclusion programs within clinical services, and I know the NICE guidelines, especially in the mental health kind of strands, have kind of specific recommendations for how services can work with organisations in the community to engage those groups that may have really poor outcomes or may struggle to access psychological services in various forms. There's also a role for us in the room, really, and for us who are qualified and clinically active in various stages of training, about our ability to work with minoritized groups of all descriptions, not just ethnic minority groups, but other protected groups characteristics as well. And so for us to be trained and to kind of be skilled up, really, in our knowledge about working with diversity, that was one of the points that was raised earlier by one of the ladies at the back of the room, so that we are able to be more attuned in delivering our interventions that are in a way that's appropriate for the communities that we work with. So in my role at the university, we were also involved in a lot of kind of curriculum changes, really, having qualified, the next generation of qualified psychologists coming away from our training programme with much more clearer understanding about the importance of self in relation to their practice as clinical psychologists, but also in the adaptation of existing skills. So leaving our programme with reflective skills, adaptive approaches to existing models, thinking about systemically about communities and thinking about health inequalities. They're all important part of the training journey at Birmingham, but that's a response in which we may be able to generate a new generation of practitioners who are more attuned at working with diversity in its various forms. And then the last point is around kind of research, really. We've had a lady talk about the importance of evidence-based interventions, but thinking about, well, how do we adapt our existing models and what is the evidence base of these new models for those groups who may or may not be able to engage with psychological therapies in its current state, really. But the model that I'd like to talk to you today about is about a representative workforce, really, primarily on the basis of ethnicity, really. And this is an idea or theory about the importance of having a workforce which is balanced or can represent the communities in which it is embedded in, really. And by having a representative workforce ethnically, service users, services are more attuned to those communities, which may overcome some of the inherent inequalities that we see in existing models of mental health and psychological services delivery. And these are some of the quotes from the BPS and by Hay, which kind of articulates these ideas quite nicely. But we know that so achieving a kind of ethnically diverse workforce, there are some challenges. And I guess, you know, in 2016 and 2007, there was beginning to be much more awareness, definitely within the psychological community, about the barriers to access of psychological therapies for those from minoritized backgrounds. And so these stats have changed over the years, but I just thought I'd put them up here as a way to kind of set the scene, really, for the direction in which we are now kind of in, really, as a profession. However, over time, I think the patterns of access to psychological therapist training, in particular clinical psychology training, and this is what a lot of our work is based around, it's a HE-funded training course, as many as you're aware. The disparities have seemed to lessen over time, definitely at Birmingham anyway, in that those people, communities that apply, are equally represented in our training programs to some degree. But just because there's less barriers in terms of access to psychological training doesn't mean the workforce is representative of the communities, really. You may have less barriers in access to psychological therapies for different groups now than you did previously, but that doesn't really mean that your service or your trust or your organisation matches or marries that of the communities who live or access your services. And so it's very important to distinguish the two from having equity and access to training by ethnic groups and a representative workforce. They are closely linked, but they're just two distinct kind of ideas, really. And so today I'm thinking with you about some of our efforts to begin to unpick a representative workforce and what does that mean. So achieving equality in the workforce raises a lot of anxieties for people. And I think equality, diversity, inclusion work generally makes the profession feel really anxious. You know, who are we going to be disadvantaging by making certain groups come on into our profession? What groups are going to be left out, really? But what is illegal in this process is positive discrimination. No organisation can positively discriminate someone based on ethnicity in terms of their access to training. I mean, that's unlawful. So if you've got two candidates or two communities who live in your area, you can't just have a kind of a quota of a particular group because they're underrepresented. That would be illegal. And so what we're talking about in this space is about strategies or approaches that might encourage those communities who are some way underrepresented in the workforce, really. The law's very clear, so we need to kind of ensure there is evidence around disadvantage or there's particular needs of a particular community who don't participate in the workforce in your training program. And then so these kind of areas are the foundations of equality, diversity, inclusion work with regards to the workforce stratification or equality with the workforce. So this is the Equality Act, sections 159, 158 and 149. All organisations, whether it's a health institute, higher education institute or a healthcare service or healthcare trust, has a legal responsibility to ensure that inequalities or discrimination in the workforce, the promotion or recruitment, are kind of responded to appropriately, really. And so our equality, diversity, inclusion workforce programmes should kind of embed this idea and think about what groups are most in need. There are two different parts to equality, diversity, inclusion programmes. The first is about kind of positive action, and that might include outreach work or careers talks and mentoring schemes to attract those communities or groups who may not otherwise be aware of your profession or are some way underrepresented within your existing workforce. The other point is about direct action, and this is more about when candidates are applying for clinical training or applying for a position, you're able to kind of select a trainee who is minoritized in some way or experience disadvantaged as long as they are equal scoring. And so they have to be able to meet the requirements of the job, but you might be able to select them based on some form of disadvantage you may think they may experience. But to achieve these steps, in order to have a more kind of representative workforce, there is a kind of a challenge, really, and that's about evidence. How do you evidence that one community is underrepresented within your workforce or your service? It's a real challenge, really. I mean, where are you going to get the data from? And so we're aware nationally about those people who get onto clinical training and other training doctorates. But Britain is very, very diverse in terms of population makeup. You've got really kind of urban areas like Birmingham and the Black Country, and Sandwell in particular, in the area that I work, really hyper-diverse, lots of communities that live there. And you also, 10 miles down the road, very rural areas that are kind of more uniform in their ethnicity, mainly from white British backgrounds, with smaller pockets of diversity. And so this kind of national picture of what does the workforce look like isn't really an accurate representation of the communities that you work on your doorstep, really. And so when you think about local services or local education providers, it's then hard to use that national data to kind of inform what's gone on the ground, really. And as part of our EDI work, we're very much keen to ensure that at the local population are represented, not only in terms of our training cohorts, our academic communities, our student body, but also in terms of the workforce, which is why we're working with the PPN and the BPS to really puzzle this out, really, and think about what is needed. But there is a question about terminology in this work that I think we need to kind of identify, really. Like, often you see it kind of described in the media as being kind of like black versus white, or Asian versus, black. These are very broad terms that describe kind of people's ethnicity, but don't really explain culture and communities. We have here the term BAME mentioned, where we lump all ethnic groups into one, or people of the global majority, or racial or minoritized groups. And so the language is really important in this discussion, really, in thinking about what do we mean by underrepresented? Who are we referring to? And what measures are we going to be employing to begin to address and think about these issues? And how can we know? So we've been engaging with a piece of work jointly with Sunny and with James, with Daniel, with Lawrence from the BPS as well, to think about what methodologies can we employ to think about the representation of the workforce. We've mainly focused on the practitioner psychologist community because they are trained through HEE often, and also those posts are more clearly defined in existing models. And so what I'm presenting today really is the data that we've generated through this piece of work. So as you do with research or any form of service evaluation, you need to really clear and define the groups in which you're kind of thinking about and the population area. And so what we've decided on is to kind of, based on our kind of objectives with the BPS and the PPN, we focus on 2 ICBs to think about the psychological representation within those groups. We've mainly focused on the clinical psychologist, practitioner psychologist in healthcare settings area. And we used information from Freedom of Information requests that we sent out to trusts within the patch, as well as data from the Leeds Clearinghouse and census data about the population makeup of those 2 ICBs. And some of this data is freely available online. You can do this yourselves in your own regions, but we've done this bespokely for the Birmingham and Solihull ICB and the Black Country ICB, as these are the areas that our trainees go out onto placement. These are the geographical patches. So we're based in Birmingham at the moment, which is kind of in this kind of area as well. But the population, I think, is over 2 million. I mean, so you know this sort of, yeah. So it's not the whole West Midlands, but it's a really kind of quite densely populated communities, different needs, different histories, but do a lot of psychological work. We've got data around ethnicity of those who are currently practicing in the area cross-sectionally. So that was in January 2023. We sent some Freedom of Information requests out to all the local trusts in the area, asking them for the ethnic backgrounds of their workforce. We also requested to the local trusts, 3 local trusts who provide mental health services for the communities in these patches, the ethnicity of their service users. So what proportion of your service users across adults, child and older adult services and specialist mental health services as well, what's the ethnic makeup? And these trusts also input into the physical health hospitals as well through strategic, what's the word, sorry? Strategic, SL, yeah, that thing. I don't work in physical health, so you have to bear with me. But agreements between local mental health trusts and community trusts. So I think we got most of the workforce there, although we didn't get data from everyone. And then we got data from the census, really, for these areas. We've also using other data as well, but this is in process. But today I'm going to be talking about the outputs from these data points. So, preliminary findings, what do we find? Next slide, please. So this is the data from the census, which is just giving you the context of Britain or England and Wales versus the region of the West Midlands. And the region of West Midlands is slightly bigger than the ICBs. It includes places like Coventry, I think Shropshire, Worcester as well. But you can see from this, as we move from England to the West Midlands region, our area becomes way more diverse. So in particular, you've got the Asian Pakistani community here for England and Wales. When we come to the regional level, those numbers begin to increase, really. These are percentages, by the way. Whereas the white group kind of stays consistent over. There's a big jump in the black and white Caribbean mixed group as you move to the Midlands. So as you see, as we move to thinking more regionally, diversity becomes much more of an important regional factor that we need to hold in mind, and our workforce will need to think about representing those communities. So now I'm presenting data about the Black Country and Birmingham ICBs in conjunction with each other, really, using the data. So how diverse are these populations? Not service use, the generic population using census data. So we can see that at the Birmingham Black Country, Birmingham and Solihull, and Black Country ICBs, the white community or white population drops drastically from 70% at the regional level to around 57%. And so you see there's a really massive change here in demographics. We see the next biggest ethnic group has been the Asian Pakistani community, still way under the 50% by quite a margin, but quite a distinct community in itself. We see the Asian British Indian community really big as well, Black Caribbean, Black African, and also Bangladeshi, the Bangladeshi community as well, who make up a significant portion at the kind of ICB level. So what this data is really showing us is that regionally we're quite a diverse community, or ICBs at least, and that will need to factor into our idea about our workforce and, who do we represent on the ground. I've got 5 minutes. Okay, I've over-talked, so I'm going to have to rush these last slides. So this is the data about service use. So in those same ICBs, we've sent freedom of information requests to the local trusts, asking them what's the ethnic breakdown of those who use your service. So you can see that about 50% of all service users in both ICBs are from white backgrounds, which is the big portion. The next 2 data points are not known and not stated, and that makes up over 20% of the data. We don't have recorded information about the workforce. The next biggest group, I think, is the Asian Pakistani group, which kind of makes sense based on the kind of regional data. Asian Indian being next, Caribbean, and then the mixed groups, and the others are really small percentages. But one noticeable group that's really big in the service is the Asian that we need to think about is the Asian Bangladeshi community. And despite them being quite small here, in the next slide you'll see, the slide previously we recognised that they were big in the population. So this is just the numerical data from that pie chart, because I couldn't get them both onto the same slide. So we'll move on to the next one, if that's okay. So a few months ago, the Healthcare Professionals Council presented some data about the ethnicity of the workforce at the practitioner level for psychologists. That's all the different types of psychology, health, clinical, educational, which showed that actually in the workforce nationally, 84% of psychologists are from white backgrounds. And I use very broad and crude terms of ethnicity here, but I thought it would be very good to kind of show actually, as you move across from practitioner psychologists to clinical psychologists, there isn't much shift really. But in comparison to all professions, psychology registered by the HCPC, there's a big uplift in those who are those from white backgrounds, and a reduction in those from other ethnic minorities. So for instance, the Asian group, about 5% of all professionals registered by the HCPC are from Asian backgrounds, where that drops down to 1% at the clinical psychology level. So there is a difference between all healthcare professions ethnicity and those in the psychological practitioners community. So I'm just going to probably finish in this slide now because I've spoken too much, and I've got some other slides that I thought I could go into, but maybe that won't come through for questions. And this is probably the most important slide really. So this is showing you the psychologists who are registered, currently practicing in both Birmingham and Solihull ICB and Black Country ICB, and also the census really. So you can see from the white group, seems in those two ICBs, there seem to be kind of similar patterns. I mean, these are subjective, not statistical observations, just what I've eyeballed really in the data. However, the Asian Pakistani community, despite making up 10% of the population, are represented at about 3.2% within the current existing workforce, really. Equally, for the Asian Bangladeshi community, despite being 2.6% in the general population in the ICB, they're really represented a really small, a small community, 6.5%, sorry, that's 0.65% in the workforce in those ICBs. And we see also a massive difference between the Asian Indian group. So despite being a small percentage in the general population, there are a bigger percentage of the workforce. So there are some trends really in the workforce data compared to the general population data, in particular the Asian Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities, and also those from mixed white and black backgrounds as well. So you can see there's a big change there. But these are just kind of preliminary kind of observations. There aren't really statistical. I've probably finished now, I think. Yeah. There's things I could go on and talk about, really. I'm not really timing this. But I'll be, yeah, that's fine.
Look, I know we rushed you, but thank you. What's been really important about this work is this has been the first attempt we've tried to triangulate all the available data and try to make sense of it. And our ultimate hope is that we get to a place where once we finalise the write-up of this, that actually what we're able to share is a methodological approach that could then be used across other ICSs to do exactly the same. And that was our intention behind doing that. Yeah? Lawrence, would you agree? That was...
Yeah, absolutely, and also then to go out and start changing it.
Absolutely, because that's actually where we started.
Yeah.
It was very simple, we need to do that.
Absolutely.
A bit more.
That's brilliant.
No?
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes, I'm going to like
the national benchmarking exercise that's happened recently, will that add to this kind of data? Because I know the ethnicity information was added to that request, wasn't it?
It was, and so the way benchmarking do it is they'll be able to show us ethnicity data for the psychological professions workforce as a whole. They'll also be able to show it for the psychological professions workforce by pathway. It won't be by profession. The reason for that is that they were absolutely convinced that they wouldn't get responses for if it was by profession, because in their experience people aren't willing to share that data at that sort of level, particularly in smaller occupations. So it will add to the it will definitely add to the picture.
I think there is that challenge, and I know certainly from me, if I take the PPN hat on, put the CPO hat on, when we went back to the national benchmarking team, one of the bits of feedback that we also got is that they weren't sure that providing level electronic staff records were actually set up to interrogate at the levels of the professional groups. So they felt that by doing that, actually, they would have a less likely return, because the products would turn around and say no. So I think there is that challenge. Any more questions for Luke, or observations? Adrian?
Yeah, I mean, I think my observation is we've got some work to do on making our services better for Pakistani and Bangladeshi people. And the reason I say that is, you obviously presented workforce data here. This triangulates with the fact that it's still not just likely to be successful in a clinical psychology application with a Pakistani and Bangladeshi background. And you've referenced NHS talking therapies. We've seen tremendous improvement actually in the outcomes achieved by those services for many ethnic groups, including ethnic minorities, but not for Pakistani and Bangladeshi groups to the same degree. So it really is starting to add up to a focused piece of work I think we need to do.
Thank you, Adrian. Any more questions for Luke? Luke's presentation will be also available